In all of my travels, I've never come across a more underrated camera than the one we're going to talk about today. I've basically never met anyone that knows about this camera, I don't see any YouTube content about it, and all the while I think it's easily one of the best cameras on the market. Luckily, it's pretty easy to get a hold of. All you need to do is grab a Costco hot dog, go into the bathroom, light a candle, spin around 3 times, and presto. You'll lose the hot dog, which is a little bit disappointing, but at least now we have the unsung hero of cinema cameras, the Blackmagic URSA Broadcast G2. This brings up a discussion that we've been having for a long time as a community, and that's what makes a cinema camera a cinema camera. And for the sake of discussion, I will weigh in, I suppose. Back in the day when larger sensors first were entering the prosumer market, so the Canon C100, the Canon C300, cameras like that, I think it made a lot of sense from a marketing standpoint to differentiate those from the broadcast cameras at the time because they were completely different. They had tiny sensors, they had internally zooming lenses. It was just a completely different use case. So I understand why they put on the C, why it's beneficial to call it a cinema camera and a broadcast camera. I just don't know if it matters that much now. If you ask any filmmaker what their definition of a cinema camera is, it'll be different every single time. And also, coincidentally, it'll perfectly match up with whatever camera that filmmaker owns at that moment, which I think is a little weird. I've heard that you need raw video, you need internal NDs, you need dual XLRs for it to be a cinema camera. I've heard you need global shutter and you need high frame rates for it to be a cinema camera. But if any of those were true, then the Alexa Classic wouldn't have made the cut. I think there's a little bit too much ambiguity on both sides for any of this to be productive, so we might need to just let it go. If a cinema camera is just a camera that's designed for filmmaking, that technically fits a lot of cameras on the market today. You have the traditional Venices and the Ursas, that traditional body style, but there's also beautiful theatrical releases coming out that are shot on cameras like the Sony FX3, which is a camera that is constantly under fire for not being a real cinema camera. Like I said, there's just too much ambiguity for any of this to be productive, so I think we really just need to let the whole argument go. If a brand puts cinema line or cinema or C before the name of a camera, they're just trying to say that it's designed for filmmaking. A couple months ago, Fujifilm announced the GFX Eterna, which I'm really excited about, not necessarily because of the camera itself, but because Fujifilm is entering the video space for the first time, at least for cameras. And what's really interesting is that they're calling it a filmmaking camera instead of a cinema camera. And the reasoning was that they want it to fit more use cases than just cinema. So my point is that it's all just semantics and it doesn't really matter. I think wasting any time at all arguing about a term this ambiguous is kind of a gigantic waste of your time. The Broadcast G2 has a weird name because really it's a pocket cinema camera 6K sensor in an URSA body. When this thing was announced, I thought it would blow up and I would see them everywhere, but I think the word broadcast scared people away. I kind of wonder if it should have just been called the URSA 6K, but anyway. The Broadcast G2 was actually the first camera I ever reviewed on this channel, so I do have a special fondness for it, and I wanted to revisit it because I came away with the review last time with one singular issue, and the other day I figured out how to fix it. I was combing through an old hard drive and I found all my old URSA Broadcast G2 footage from a few years ago, so I decided to practice some color grading on it. Besides being blown away by the images as always, I noticed that there was gyroscopic metadata. I really don't remember there being gyro data last time. Maybe they updated it, or maybe I just didn't notice it, but the reason why this is important is because it helps with my singular issue, which is the readout speeds. At worst, we're looking at 19 milliseconds readout in 16:9 6K. This isn't the best score in the world, but even at 19 milliseconds, I don't have issues with normal usage. Since the gyroscopic metadata is available, as long as you input the correct focal length in the slate menu, you can head into Resolve on the Color tab, click on the tracker, and then Stabilization, choose gyro data, set the strength to 0, and then click Stabilize. The gyroscopic stabilization is really nice on Blackmagic cameras, and I use it pretty often to add a little bit of smoothness, but at the very least, setting the strength to 0 will drastically reduce rolling shutter artifacts without doing additional stabilization. This is really exciting because this initially was my only hang-up. Let's recap all the other good stuff. Inside the full metal chassis is a well-loved 6K Super 35 sensor with a maximum resolution of 6144 by 3456 and dual native ISOs at 400 and 3200. We already talked about readout, so let's get to dynamic range. Cinedy's charts show a signal-to-noise ratio of 1 at 12.9 stops and a signal-to-noise ratio of 2 at 11.8. These days I usually reference the signal-to-noise ratio of 1 number as total dynamic range, which is actually perfectly in line with Blackmagic's claimed 13 stops. Although I'm really liking Latitude tests because they take into account color shifting and noise pattern. The reason why we do this is because it gives a really good visual representation of exactly where you're going to start clipping, so you know how far you can push your sensor. The only weird thing is that I wish I had more cameras, or at least more similar cameras, to compare the Broadcast G2 with. The only camera that I have access to test results for Latitude is the Canon C400. They're pretty different in terms of price point, features, but at least we can get a pretty good idea of how they compare. Here we are at 0, so this is correctly exposed. We're not pushing or pulling in either direction. Go to +1, looks good. +2 looks good. +3 looks good. When we go to 4, you can see it cracking a little bit more. On Gerard over here, we might be losing a little bit of detail on his cheek, but that's okay. He's actually the color of sour cream, so he's gonna start clipping a little bit before I do. 5 stops. We have reached our end point. 5 stops is pretty respectable. The thing that the Broadcast G2 and all Blackmagic cameras have up their sleeve is a highlight recovery, which I have right here. This is the exact same shot. I'll toggle between the two with highlight recovery on and off. What you're gonna notice is there's a whole bunch of detail that's brought back. If you look at Gerard, he is just absolutely toast on this. A lot of the detail comes back. On the background, same thing. I'm still not going to count this as a stop as far as this Latitude test goes because of this not so great color shifting on my face. From what I understand, it's taking unclipped channels and trying to estimate what the signal would look like, so it's not always super accurate, especially when it comes to color. This is not a usable result. You'll notice it on human skin, especially because we just intuitively know what skin should look like. So anytime you get a shift this bad, it's gonna look not great. It is impressive how much detail you can get back though. If you're, I don't know, shooting out of a window or something that's already kind of out of the scene and you just want to get a little bit more detail back, that's what that's good for. I also love that Blackmagic gives you the opportunity to toggle that on and off. If you're shooting with red, they actually force you into using highlight recovery by default. So we'll cap it at 4 stops. And real quick, so that you can get a gauge for what other cameras are scoring in this area, we have the Canon C400, like I said. This is in RAW. 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stop, looking good. 4 stops looking good too. Gerard is starting to lose a lot of detail, which is very interesting. We still had most of the detail, if not almost all of the detail on Gerard's face with the Broadcast G2 at this point, maybe a little bit on his cheek that was gone. And at the 5 stop point, we have capped out. So pretty similar. Now let's get to the fun part. We're back at 0. So we have exposed correctly once again as a baseline, and now we're going to stop the lens down a stop for each one and do the same exact thing, bring the exposure back up. The underexposure part of the test is a little bit less cut and dry because we can't just look at when my skin is gonna clip and then cap it right there and give it a result. We're gonna have to make a judgment call on what we think is usable as far as noise pattern goes. So obviously how high the noise floor is going to affect this test, but also color shifting, fixed noise pattern, anything like that. And I think that the Broadcast G2 is really, really impressive in this area. So 0, we're obviously looking pretty good. 1 stop under, nothing bad. I like the noise pattern on this camera. -2 stops. A little bit of texture, would be really, really easy to denoise, perfectly usable. 3 stops under. Still just a color space transform. I'm gonna go into a darker spot here, like my hair. There is a significant amount of noise here. If we're gonna pop in and pixel peep like this, we're at almost 500% in and we're seeing some noise. I would probably denoise this if this was going to be on a big screen, but I would call this usable for sure. Noise pattern looks great, very granular. I don't think the color of the noise is super distracting or weird or anything like that. All right, -4. As we get into the bottom stops, I will do some noise reduction, maybe some contrast work to see if we can squeeze out an extra stop or 2. Because before we do that, there is a significant amount of noise here. If we're looking at my hair like last time, but more importantly, if we're looking at like the shadow side of my face, there is a lot of noise here. What I've done is helped the contrast a little bit with the curve. Sometimes when you're underexposing a whole bunch, it can get a little bit crunchy and the contrast can shift a little bit. So I've nudged it. If you're curious, this is what I've done. I've just raised the black point up a touch and done a ramp so that it can look a little bit smoother and not so crunchy. And then here is some quick and dirty noise reduction. There's still some texture in this shot, but I would call this usable, especially when we bump out. You could be a little bit more precious with your settings in noise reduction. I think this is a usable result, which is pretty impressive because we are at 4 stops over and 4 stops under now. That is 8 stops of exposure latitude. Unfortunately, that is where it's going to cap out though. I'll turn off the adjustments in 5 stops under. There is a lot of noise here. Just real quick, we'll do some contrast. We'll take a noise reduction and absolutely crank it. Yeah, I mean, depending on the shot, if you're not shooting a portrait like this, maybe you could get this 5th stop to work, but I'm gonna go ahead and call it there. I don't think this is a good enough result. And just for reference, really quick, we'll go back and visit the C400 to see how it's doing. C400 at 0, obviously looks good. 1 stop under. I won't harp on this camera too much because I feel like I've been giving it a really hard time. There's already some noise in here. It doesn't look too bad yet, but the noise itself is really crunchy and kind of weird looking. When I say crunchy, I mean digital, not filmic, granular, pixel level noise. It's more blocky, weird, sharp noise. 2 stops under. You can look at this hard case back here. There's a lot of noise. Still would call this usable, but we're getting there. Here we are at 3. I'll turn off my adjustments really quick. In the last video where we tested this camera, this is where I called the C400. There's just not a lot of detail left, but you can do noise reduction. You can do a little bit of contrast work. There is the Broadcast G2 at 3 stops underexposed. There is the C400 at 3 stops underexposed. So significantly cleaner than the C400. This is especially impressive because the Broadcast G2 sensor is older. It's Super 35 versus the C400, and it was using, in this test, a more compressed codec. So the C400 actually had a higher bit rate here. Really impressive on the Broadcast G2's part. Earlier I did mention dual native ISOs, and I always forget how clean 3200 is on this camera. The noise floor is surprisingly low, and the pattern itself is granular, even, and beautiful. It's easy to work with, easy to denoise, and beautiful if you decide to leave some in for some texture. Of all the cameras I've used, I think this is my favorite noise pattern so far, which is becoming more and more important to me. Let's talk about color science. Now, it's not lost on me that this is incredibly subjective. Any of these modern cameras in this category, you can get stellar images from. But if you care about color science right out of the gate, maybe you don't want to do a whole bunch of color grading and you just want to slap a LUT or a CST on the image and then move on, I wouldn't recommend that. But if for some reason you just don't have time or something and you only have time to do a LUT, or you're going to bake the LUT into the footage, this is what the differences would look like. Now, this is a standard talking head shot that I would normally do in this set right here. This is with the Broadcast G2 in 6K, 12:1 Blackmagic RAW. There is absolutely nothing on this shot except for a CST that is taking it from Blackmagic RAW Film Gen 5 to Rec 709. The only camera that I have to compare this with is, again, the Canon C400, which is kind of fun because everybody loves Canon color science. There's the difference between the two: Blackmagic Canon, Blackmagic Canon, Blackmagic Canon. You can, of course, make up your mind for what you think looks better. If you want my opinion, I do prefer Blackmagic's color science over Canon. Now, a lot of people buy Canon cameras to get this look straight out of camera. For me personally, I think that everything gets pushed a little bit too far into the pink direction. And when you look at the Blackmagic, first of all, the green in my shirt is intact and looks like the green that shirt actually is. And in the Canon, it just can't get that color right. It just is too magenta. Both of these were white balanced exactly the same, by the way. My skin is a little bit more orange. There's a little bit more nuance in my lips and such. And on the Canon, everything is just kind of pink. So yeah, there's a difference here, but you could make both of them look fantastic. Got one last shot, which is the talking head for this video. We'll put the sauce on. This one was recorded in ProRes, so we can't grab the exposure wheel there. That is fine. I'm gonna go to color correction. This node by default is working in my timeline color space, which is always DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. And just to make sure, we are using timeline on gamma and color space within the HDR wheels. So exposure right here, global exposure, does a really good job. I'll put it right there. I have this spotlight going here. There's some color back here. So this is kind of an intensely lit scene with a lot of hard light. Choose to lean into that or make it a little bit softer. I think I'll make it a bit softer. I want to maintain a dark black point. And then for this specific look, I'm going to go into my film emulation and I'm going to turn it all the way up from 50% to 100%. And then I'm going to change it from cinematic to vintage. I'm gonna go between those two so you guys can look at that. Look at the green. Kind of feels like it's compressing the colors a bit. That looks pretty cool. My point is, doesn't matter the codec if you're shooting in Blackmagic RAW. Blackmagic RAW is amazing. You can do a ton to the footage and it won't crack. You can shoot in ProRes. ProRes is also amazing. A lot of the time I'm recording with this camera, I'm shooting in ProRes HD and it looks fantastic. You can save a little bit of space on your hard drives. ProRes is able to handle tough grades. I love the colors right out of a CST or LUT with this camera, but there's a lot you can do with it. Besides Airy, I think Blackmagic has my favorite colors right out of camera. This is one of my favorite sensors for documentary type jobs because of that extra headroom you get with that second native ISO. You're always going to get the best results if you spend some time on lighting, but there's still a lot of peace of mind that comes with knowing you can push your sensor pretty far and still get good results. This is the part where I usually talk about physical design and ergonomics and stuff, but honestly, I've covered this exact body style so many times I'm feeling a bit like a broken record. In short, this is the closest thing to perfection I've ever used. It's a Goldilocks weight, the IO's perfection, you get internal indies, great audio controls, perfect button placement, swappable lens mounts, solid build quality, great thermals, and on top of it all, an operating system that makes every other operating system in the industry feel like it's decades behind. Usually URSA's new come out at around $6,000, maybe a little bit more, unless it's the really ultra high-end URSA Cine models. The URSA Broadcast G2 is $4,200 USD, which is an insane price for a camera this solid. I was actually able to buy mine used in like new condition for $2,500 shipped, which is a ridiculous price. I think it is an absolutely amazing camera. I wish more people knew about it, and even at its new price point, I think it kind of cooks anything else in the market. Hey, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.